Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tatta.
Hey there, Campbell. Welcome. It's great to chat with you today.
I'm really excited to chat, Joe.
Me too. I'm really excited to get into a little bit of breath work. I know we're going to talk about it. Maybe we'll do something experiential, which could be fun. As long as people aren't driving, they can work with us, or maybe they can pull over or step off the treadmill if they're, listening at the gym or something like that. By training, you're a physiotherapist, right?
Correct. Yes. I've been a physio for 10 years, but then about 6 years ago, I kind of started going down this rabbit hole, which hasn't really ended, into the world of kind of how breathwork really impacts all the systems of the body.
How did you get started on that pathway, on that journey?
It was honestly, it was the Wim Hof method. There was this Vice documentary on this crazy Dutch guy climbing mountains in the snow, and it piqued my interest. And so I watched that and thought could be something to this, but then it really came from the practice. I sat down and I did the breath work. And that's my first experience outside of a yoga class where I've consciously manipulated my breathing. And it was pretty impactful, honestly, in that first session. And I decided to do it again. And over about a week, I was like, all right, I really want to know more because I'm feeling different. My energy started to change. I was sleeping better. Over the course of a couple of weeks, I started to lose a little bit of weight. I was becoming a bit less reactive and just seemed to have more time. And I've never really looked back since. I often joke that the Wim Hof method didn't open the door. It kind of kicked it off the hinges. But that was really just the first taste of it. And from there, I've really started to explore the full spectrum of what's out there in the breathwork world.
And how long have you been working with the breath, so to speak?
So pretty consistently now for about 6 years.
It's kind of weird because, as physios, we learn about obviously the respiratory system, but you've definitely taken it to a whole, much deeper, different level.
When I kind of reflected through the 5 years of schooling I did, we only really addressed breathing dysfunction in light of neurological injury. We didn't start to explore it as a tool, for healing and self-regulation and mood regulation. So when I started going into it, I had this, I think back, I tried to keep my clinical work and what I was exploring with breathwork somewhat separate. Because at the time, there just wasn't, the evidence base. And as physios, we really do like to live by that, well, where's the randomized controlled trials? And so for a while, I was really keeping them separate, but I found they started to integrate. And my clinical practice, vastly improved when I was able to manage more than just, the presenting symptoms and start to help people with anxiety and with sleep and with energy regulation. And so over time, it's kind of really blended a little bit more. And we now do have a lot of the supporting evidence to see, how it can provide the results that it does.
Yeah. How do you describe what breathwork is to a patient or someone who's looking for some kind of health solution, or maybe even to a practitioner who's just starting to, become aware of this?
Yeah, so my intention is really to help people not create this separate bracket of breathwork's this thing over here. And I like to think everything's breathwork. That big sigh of relief we might take when we're feeling a little bit flustered, that's an unconscious breathwork. My body's attempting to self-regulate. And so is me sitting down and doing, a more dynamic practice for 15 or 20 minutes. So I like to think of whenever we are consciously controlling or using our breath for a specific outcome, we can kind of term that breath work. Within that, there's quite a wide array of tools and practices we can use. Whereas what I think most people see breath work is, the Wim Hof methods or the conscious connected breathing, where it is this much more dynamic, often hyperventilatory. And people get a little bit of an idea as to like, well, that's not for me, but really it's, these little moments that we can take that do start to calm us down or slow us down, I think are just as important, if not more, because we can do that anywhere we are, any time of day. We don't have to wait until we can sit on the yoga mat for 20 minutes to do breath work. I think we want to have a little bit more control throughout the day.
Yeah, I love that because people think, oh, yoga is breath work. And it's like, well, yes, obviously in the yoga practices, there is breath work. In mindfulness practices, there are breath work, but you can bring it in, as you mentioned, other ways. And it's also it's part of, our entire being, basically. There's a component of breath that is under our conscious control. And there's a component, obviously, that's unconscious. Are people kind of surprised at that when they first start to work with the breath? Because it's not something that people are aware or think of, 24/7 hours a day.
It's a really good point, and I think this is a lot of the resistance that I find is I'm breathing all the time. What do I need to do, or what do I need to learn? And breathing is this very interesting, it's almost a paradox that yes, it is automatic, but it is also under conscious control. And that simple shift of, is my breath happening to me versus am I doing my breath, comes from a complete different locus of control in the brain. And that allows us to then, step into the driver's seat of the autonomic nervous system in a way and take it from autopilot and bring it back under manual control and then steer, and then direct ourselves where we want to go. But I think because it is something we do, every moment of every day, unconsciously for most people, we start to kind of discount its perhaps utility because I'm already doing it.
Right. Although they may not be doing it in a way that's beneficial to their body, so to speak, right?
Yeah. And what I often say is automatic does not mean optimal, and we as physical therapists, a great example I often use is, people are walking all the time. It doesn't mean I don't correct their gait if they're not walking well and if it's not impacting them, biomechanically. So just because we do something a lot doesn't necessarily mean that we're kind of going to be good at it.
Yeah, I like that analogy. That's a really good analogy. So, and under this kind of, automatic control, we think of the autonomic nervous system. I think probably over the last 2 years, people are really starting to become aware of the autonomic nervous system, what it is. How does breathwork tie into us regulating our own autonomic nervous system?
Such a great question, because to me, I think the primary benefit of breathwork is what it does do to the autonomic nervous system. And so I like to, we all hear of the sympathetic versus parasympathetic, and it kind of sets up this one or the other. But really, when we look at it, it's a bit more of a spectrum. Things can take me towards the sympathetic state or towards the parasympathetic state. And so if we think of the autonomic nervous system more or less like the operating system of the body, it's the conductor of the orchestra, the breath becomes the remote control to that operating system. There's certain patterns or styles or parts of the breath even that have a more sympathetic tone. If I breathe through my mouth, if I breathe quickly, if I breathe up into my chest, if the inhale is really dominant, those things are going to push me towards a sympathetic state. And vice versa, if I breathe through my nose, if I'm taking nice, slow, diaphragmatic breaths and maybe extending the exhales, they're going to lean me towards the parasympathetic state. So just having that understanding of how I breathe is going to push me in one or the other direction, then I can start to have, well, what state do I want to be in? Am I going to exercise, or am I going to play with my kids? Or am I going, to the board meeting, or to sit down and meditate? And so that way I can choose what breath pattern is going to take me in the direction that I'd like to go.
Good. I'm noticing my breathing starting to change just as you're speaking, because as you speak, I'm getting these little cues of maybe things I should be doing or should not be doing as I breathe. I want to kind of stop on this point for a minute, because you're talking about us having conscious control of our breath, right? Which sometimes is not, like when we sleep, for example, it's not under our conscious control. But throughout different life activities, it may benefit us to have conscious control of that, right? So it may benefit you to shift more into a parasympathetic state. It may benefit you to shift more into a sympathetic state. You touch on a couple of things. So for example, you mentioned like exercise or maybe playing a sport. How could we use the breath to help us shift into a more sympathetic state? And why would that be beneficial, let's say, to an athlete or someone exercising?
Yeah, so the two things with exercise are a great example. We can kind of look at the nervous system state, but then we can also look at physiology. And so with the nervous system state, what we know happens with the sympathetic state, is a state of higher arousal, if we want to call it that. And so my attention, my focus is much more on the external world. I've got blood going to my heart and my lungs and my limbs, right? Rather than my digestive tract and reproductive system. So just in that, where we think of, well, where do I want my blood flow and oxygen delivery to be going? The muscles that we're using. And so that's where being in a more sympathetic state is probably beneficial in exercise, but also looking at physiology, the delivery of oxygen and removal of waste and maintaining my aerobic capacity is very dependent on my ability to retain the right amount of carbon dioxide. And we all see people, go and exercise, and I start to breathe in and out of my mouth, So that does two things. It pushes me higher up the state chart, more sympathetic than perhaps I need to be, but it also offloads a lot of carbon dioxide, which is very necessary for me to actually deliver the oxygen to where I need to go. So it kind of, in exercise, I like people to think of it almost as a rate limiting factor. It's like, how far up the sympathetic state do I want to go? How far do I want to push? Or do I perhaps need to control my breathing to stay in a more, conducive state to be here a little bit longer, because we see this kind of boom bust. It's like the excitement of the exercise or the starting of the game, and I go out of the blocks pretty quickly and hard, and then I crash, the lactic acid builds up. And so that can often be prevented by controlling breathing in that, beginning state and having a bit more influence over where my breath's going.
I love that. So, for example, like an athlete may modulate their breathing throughout a game, let's say. So, for example, if they're just getting into the game and just starting, they may want to shift more to sympathetic. But if they're on the bench for a while, let's say, they may be able to kind of downregulate and modulate what's happening in their body, so to speak.
Exactly. The analogy I often get, if we look at something like martial arts, where it's like 1 or 2 minutes of something very intense, and then I've got maybe a 1-minute break. And in that 1-minute break, what I do is very important, because usually if we just sit and let our breathing happen, we'll stay in that kind of heightened state of arousal, right? Versus if I can actually try and slowly bring my breathing back down to what would be considered parasympathetic, I restore the chemistry, I shift myself into recovery, even if only momentarily, but better to get into recovery for a short period of time than not at all. And then I might bring myself back into that state of higher arousal to perform again. So that kind of performance recovery switch, I think, is really important. And outside of that example, I go for the run, I run 5 miles, and how long am I kind of huffing and puffing and panting and perhaps breathing uncontrolled afterwards? Whereas I could just, push my nervous system into recovery state pretty quickly. And so I've shifted from performance to recovery. I've started to divert the blood flow. I've shifted the priority from action to recovery.
I love that. And any way we can, give people a little bit of control over their health, I think is so important. So talk to me then, because as you're talking, there's definitely a lot of consciousness and awareness that has to be brought to someone's breathing, right?
Very much so.
How do you start to kind of keep people into, okay, you have this breath thing, you have a diaphragm, et cetera. How do you start to bring awareness around that?
Yeah, awareness is my favorite word. And I would teach breath awareness the same way that I would teach, postural awareness. Breath awareness and improving your breathing is not about trying to be conscious of every single breath that you take. You take upwards of 22,000 every day. It's just not going to happen. And I think when people do have that idea of like, oh, now I need to, make sure that every breath I take is right, it just becomes this overload, and it's just not possible. The same way that I don't instruct someone, you need to have, quote unquote, perfect posture all day, every day. It's not going to happen, right? It's more about recognizing when I default into a non-optimal pattern, right? And that might be through the biomechanical lens, right? If someone places one hand on their chest and one hand on their tummy, right? And if they can feel their breath, kind of moving up into the chest, the collarbones, the shoulders, that's not as efficient as breathing with the diaphragm, right? It's just using the accessory respiratory muscles. It has an impact on the nervous system. So that little check-in and seeing, I'm breathing up a little bit higher than perhaps I need to be. And then rerouting, and breathing back into the lower lobes of the lungs, into the rib cage. Or same thing, I might notice, my mouth's open. I was really concentrating on this task or writing this email, and I'm breathing through my mouth. I noticed that, close my mouth, back to nasal breathing. Those little kind of cue and response starts to carve out this neurological groove that simply makes us more aware. I do catch it when my breathing moves higher into my body. I do catch it when I start breathing through my mouth. And so rather than having the idea of I have to be aware all the time, I want to know what to look for and use that as a little reminder of, let me take a moment and check in. Oh, I'm stressed, I'm breathing quickly or shallow. Let me do something about that and then get back to the task at hand.
So you mentioned mouth breathing a couple of times. Talk to me about the difference between breathing through your mouth versus breathing through your nose and why that could be important for someone.
Yeah, it's huge, honestly. This thing on the front of our face is not just for aesthetics. It serves a very important evolutionary and biological function, that it's filtration, and I think when you start to dive into the complexity of the nose, it's pretty fascinating. So the air comes in, we've got these tiny little microscopic hairs. There's more hairs in the nose than there is on the top of our head, right? And that's the first line of our immune defense and filtration. So we're trapping pathogens. The mucosal lining, we then can also mount an immune response through immunoglobulins in the nose. We have these turbines that start to spiral the air, humidify it, and then they mix it with this really interesting molecule called nitric oxide, which is produced in the paranasal sinuses. It's antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral, and it's a potent vaso and bronchodilator, right? So how intricate, human nature, or the human body and Mother Nature, right? The entry to our body, it cleans the air, it humidifies it, it warms it, and it starts to relax my blood vessels so I can extract the oxygen and remove the carbon dioxide. The moment I open my mouth, I bypass that entire system, right? The air goes straight into my upper airways, into my lungs. Now the cilia in my lungs, I have to work to get all of the stuff that we can't see, that's floating around in the air, that's not meant to be in my lungs, and so this can come up as phlegm and coughs and chest irritation. So the nose is really, really important, and arguably we should be breathing with it 99% of the time, unless we're talking, eating, right, or drinking, the mouth should be closed. And that's how it's been for a really long time. And that started to change. And we can kind of look to different causative factors, maybe it's the change in diet, the change in jaw structure, environmental influence, but we've got control over that, right? I can close my mouth and I can start to breathe back through my nose. And the more I do that, the easier it becomes to maintain.
I love that description. It's always amazing, like when you kind of get into the physiology of the body, how incredible our human anatomy and physiology are, and how they, really work together. So there are people who have impairments, conditions, dysfunctions. What are some of the things, like, so if you're evaluating someone, what are some of the things that you're looking for, like kind of on a more, clinical level?
Yeah. So I start my assessment, before I start my assessment, just with observation. If I'm sitting and talking to someone, I'm actually spying a little bit, is because you'll understand the same thing as most practitioners do. If I say to someone, I'm going to look at your posture now, all of a sudden they float tall and their shoulders come back and they got great posture, So if I say to someone, I'm going to assess your breathing, we typically know, oh, it should be slow and it should be smooth and it should be rhythmical. So while I'm talking and someone's listening to me, I get a much clearer indication of what their baseline breathing looks like. And what I'm looking for is, are they breathing through their nose or their mouth? Can I hear it? If I can hear someone breathing sitting across from me, it's kind of telling me that they're working pretty hard at rest. And what part of their body is moving? If I'm seeing the shoulders go up and down, I know that they're not driving their breath from the diaphragm. And that's probably where I'm going to start. And so I really like to look at kind of three lenses: is the biomechanics as to what's happening as how I'm moving the air in and out of the body. The physiology is much more the biochemistry of what's happening once the air is in there. And then the nervous system, am I breathing in a way that's pushing me perhaps into a non-optimal state? And through, subjective and objective assessment, we can kind of paint a picture as to, is someone's breath helping them or hindering them? And then from there, trying to personalize, well, do we need to address biomechanics, or do we need to address your physiology, or do we need to give you tools of self-regulation? Honestly, the most people fall into, we get a little bit of all. I rarely find someone that's just, I only have an issue with biomechanics, because let's say I'm not really fully using my diaphragm, that's going to impact my physiology and that's going to impact my nervous system. So it really comes down to, where do we start rather than which one is the cause.
So it sounds like you have your own kind of like evaluation assessment built around just breathing and the respiratory system.
Yeah, and it just kind of happened out of necessity. People were coming to me as the breathing physio. I was getting patients referred to me with anxiety. And so I kind of wanted to put together a framework of like, well, what do I know what I'm looking for, but can I make it kind of repeatable? And that's something I teach my students now as well, is, whether or not you're a physio or you're a massage therapist or you're a health coach, we can assess someone's breathing. I think if you're not assessing, you're guessing. It's something I was kind of like thinking about over the last couple of days, where we see the rise in popularity of something like breathwork, and we see a very much one size fits all approach. Go and do this practice. The Wim Hof method should be good for everyone. But we know that that's just not how the body works. You're different to me and your breathing is different to mine, because your physiology and your history and your nervous system and your body are all different. So the art of kind of being able to assess and tailor an approach to someone based on that assessment, I think far outweighs the, here's a practice, it should help.
So let's try to make some connections for people around kind of certain health issues. So this podcast, we talk a lot about pain, obviously. How could your work, or how could breath work help someone with chronic pain?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I think really, really important. And to me, a lot of this comes back to the autonomic nervous system. So coming back to that kind of point we touched on earlier, where it often gets portrayed as sympathetic or parasympathetic, fight or flight or rest and digest, but that idea of somewhere on the spectrum, we know state change, the more sympathetic I am, it changes things. What am I paying attention to? What am I thinking about? My pain threshold, right? So when people are in that heightened state of sympathetic arousal, I'm much more aware of the problem, right? Whether that be physical pain or environmental or emotional or psychological, my whole nervous system, including my mind, right, what I'm thinking about, focusing on, is much more attuned to what could go wrong or what is going wrong right now. So it's very hard for people to, think of something else or move their attention or go and exercise or move or do some of the interventions that are likely to help because they're stuck in the pain. They're stuck in the sympathetic state.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times we try and use our mind to get out of that state. I'm going to focus on something else. I'm going to be positive. I'm going to look, but my mind's a reflection of my nervous system. And if my nervous system's in that heightened state, perhaps because I am breathing shallow or fast or a little bit, ragged and chaotic, then I'm going to find it really hard to use my mind to shift my body. And so what breathing allows us to do is let's calm the nervous system down. Let's come out of that state of heightened arousal where my body doesn't feel threatened, right? It doesn't feel like it's amidst the stress response. And it can actually start to shift me into a lower pain threshold. It can allow me to move my attention. It can allow me to see opportunity rather than problem because the nervous system is now no longer in this kind of threat response.
And would that be similar to, so you mentioned anxiety, would that be similar to things like anxiety and depression, where you're kind of looking at it kind of maybe through the same lens?
Yeah, and I think, if we go back to, it was probably the fault of Rene Descartes, this philosopher and scientist in the 1500s that separated mind and body. And we're still following that idea from 1502 or something, where there is this separation. But everything, today, at least in my perspective, points to we can't separate those two things. If my mind is in a certain state, it's because my body is in a certain state, not independent of. And so whether someone, and this is quite interesting, I feel with anxiety, I ask all my patients that tell me they have anxiety, and I says, is your anxiety mental or is it physical or is it emotional or is it a little bit of everything, And some people do have a very physical anxiety. It's the heart palpitations, it's the clamminess. I feel tense, I feel claustrophobic. And others, it's very mental. My mind is racing. I can't shift my thoughts. And so that, again, it's well, what if we use a tool that addresses the underlying system rather than trying to focus on your mind or your physical manifestations? What if we try and balance the nervous system? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of that is, can we recalibrate the nervous system in a way to get to a state that feels a little bit safer and a bit more balanced? Often the mind and the body are then going to kind of follow suit, if you will. And what I always like people to kind of understand or point to is breathwork's not a replacement, or at least I don't use it as one. It's a complementary tool, right? When I can shift out of that state of heightened arousal, I notice, this internal narrative that's playing is not helpful to me now, right? Now that I'm in a state that I can objectively notice that. But while I'm in that heightened state of arousal, that's just what's happening. It's hard to identify, my thoughts aren't helping me here. And vice versa, I'm in this kind of state of heightened anxiety and I might be tensing my body and my jaw might be clenched and my posture might be telling me to be anxious until I become aware of my breath and slow that down. Then I go, oh, wait, I can drop my shoulders and I can loosen my jaw. And these things that maybe I wasn't aware of because I was in such a state of high arousal are now becoming a little bit more obvious. And I can take that next step and that next step and that next step and kind of work my way out of these states that are not optimal, if we just want to kind of call them that.
It's a nice brain-body connection that you've made here. And I think that's always important that we, kind of talk about that brain-body or mind-body connection. But it's interesting because, as I listen to you speak and you're, very eloquent with all of this, it's also very different than some of the pain education and the CBT things that are happening right now with regard to pain, because those are very head-oriented things. They're really not focusing too much, if at all, on the body, but you're saying, hey, let's bring the body back into the equation, bring the whole nervous system back in, not just the brain. And then let's see how people feel with regard to their anxiety or how they feel with regard to their pain.
Yeah, and again, not one or the other, but let's bring a bottom-up approach along with the top-down approach, because I think how could that not be more effective, right? To address both sides of the equation. And for me, I think it's, having that tool of, most people have been given the tools for their mind, the CBT, the talk therapy, the positive intention, but most of them are trying to use the mind and perhaps not aware at all of the body, which can be as much of a driver, if not more in some circumstances.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that kind of idea of, well, if my nervous system, my posture, the bottom up things are saying stress, anxiety, then I'm going to have a hard time using my mind to convince my body otherwise. And if we look at the kind of efferent and afferent relationship between brain and body, there's a whole lot of information going from body to brain. And if I don't address that, right, it's kind of, I'm using the 10% to try and influence the 90% versus let me use 100%, let me use the tools for the brain and the mind and the tools for the body so that they're all saying the same thing, which is I'm safe. That's going to be, I think, much more effective than trying to use the mind to convince the body that we're safe.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, we are in a very brain-centric world, and we're kind of in a very brain-centric pain world, especially. But I think, again, go back to kind of like anatomy, and you look at the way the nervous system is set up, your body is really informing a lot of what's happening in your brain, and some of the newer kind of embodied cognitions and perception work, really talks that. All right, so you mentioned bottom up, so I want to go almost all the way to the bottom, but not quite. I want to go to the pelvic floor. And what is the relationship between the pelvic floor and breathing, let's say?
Yeah, so I always like to paint this picture so people can kind of follow along and draw this diagram in their mind. But our breathing kind of behaves as a cylinder. The roof of that cylinder is the diaphragm and rib cage. We then have, the abdominal wall, transverse abdominis, the multifidi, so the kind of walls to that cylinder. And the floor of that cylinder is the pelvic floor. And all parts of that cylinder have to work together. Breathing is not in isolation, that my diaphragm just moves up and down. As the diaphragm descends, the walls expand and the floor drops, right? And so the diaphragm or respiratory diaphragm and the pelvic floor have a very similar role. Diaphragm goes down, pelvic floor drops to accept that change in abdominal movement, right? Diaphragm ascends as I exhale, pelvic floor ascends, right? So we have this kind of integrated relationship that my diaphragm and pelvic floor are working in tandem to control intra-abdominal pressure. And that's really how we breathe. I think there's a big misconception or perhaps just lack of understanding that your lungs don't really do the breathing. They're just passive balloons. It's a change in pressure, right? My intrathoracic pressure, my intra-abdominal pressure, and then atmospheric pressure are all kind of working together to move air in and out of the body based on high pressure to low pressure. And so one of the most common dysfunctions we tend to see in breathing and pelvic floor, that relationship, is this kind of hypertonicity. All right, my pelvic floor is not dropping and relaxing to accept the diaphragm. And so now I'm kind of running into, well, it's easier to breathe up here into the chest and the shoulders because I don't have that movement or that capacity to expand down low. And whether that's postpartum, whether that's I've learned to brace, whether that's I do way too much intense core work, and I'm failing to recognize that that's meant to be a malleable, expansive part of my body, not this brick wall, that doesn't move. So in a happy world, diaphragm and pelvic floor are always talking to each other and always moving together.
So between your diaphragm and your pelvic floor, as you know, are your intestines or your gut. And so many people struggle with IBS, and they're, trying all sorts of diets and pills and supplements and things like that. Have you had people say to you, wow, since I've started to learn this breath work and how to modulate my breath, that my digestion has changed? And not only has my digestion changed, but I don't have IBS or pain anymore. And with that, of course, a whole bunch of other things follow.
Yeah, Joe, I'm so glad you kind of brought this up because I'm a physiotherapist. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a dietitian, but I've had enough clients now that amidst our conversation, right, they didn't come to me because of their dietary issues or digestive distress, but it comes up in a subjective assessment. And two things, when we look at the role of the diaphragm, breathing's just one component of that, right? The diaphragm is literally the center point of our body. And in a good, healthy person, it should move about 10 centimeters, right? That's a big range of motion, 3.5, 4 inches. And it descends and it massages the abdominal contents. But independent of that, the nervous system, right? When I'm in a sympathetic state, I have less blood flow to my digestive tract, less digestive enzymes, right? I'm just not in a state conducive to digestion. And so a lot of the clients that I work with, tell me, right, I eat my lunch while I'm sending the email, while I'm listening to the podcast, and it's I'm a little bit, too busy, or I'm too stressed, or I'm too rushed, and the implementation of let's just shut your laptop, let's step away, and let's do some down-regulating breathing for a couple of minutes before you eat. Nothing crazy, just some slow extended exhales. And I get them to wait for the salivation, right? when we start to salivate, it's a really clear indicator that I'm shifting into that parasympathetic state. And I've had numerous clients now that were going down the food sensitivity testing, right? What am I reacting to? I eat this food and I'm bloating or I'm cramping, and they couldn't find what was the culprit, And it really, idea of it's not the food that you're eating, it's the state that you're in while you're eating it. And I think that's true of many, many things. And so by being able to use the breath to shift themselves into a state that was conducive of digestion, all of a sudden their food sensitivities, their digestive distress kind of went away. And so I think it's really important, number one, the more mechanical issue of massaging and moving the abdominal contents and the blood flow that occurs with diaphragmatic movement, but also the state that puts me in, coming back to what's the appropriate state for what's going on. Am I in a board meeting or am I trying to eat my lunch?
That rest and digest is so important for people, especially with IBS. And as you mentioned, people are, spending money on all sorts of tests. And then you realize, all right, let me just work on my second brain, which is, your enteric nervous system. Let me get that to relax. So as you mentioned, there's a mechanical component to that, right? That massages your organs so that food starts to move around. And then there's that physiologic component, enzymes and nerves turning on or shutting off. I think it's so important that people start to make those whole body connections, which you're making. It's been wonderful talking. I know we could probably go on and connect to everything. I'm going to have you back because I really want to talk about the breath, heart, brain connection one day. So I'm going to kind of invite you back probably in about 6 months or so. But in the meantime, I want people to check out your work and follow you and get to know you a bit better. How can they learn more about you?
I'm definitely in for round 2. I think we can have some wonderful conversations around these topics. On social media, I'm most active at Breath Body Therapy. For the practitioners or health professionals out there, I've actually just started a free education hub on a platform called School. It's called the Breath Network. And really, this is just from seeing and working alongside lots of different practitioners that don't have an understanding of where do I start with breathing? I'm not a breathwork specialist, but my patients are breathing, and what advice can I give them? So if you're a health professional, it's a free community. You can kind of either reach out to me on social media, or maybe I can send you the link to pop in the show notes, Joe. But that's kind of just, the hub that I want people to be able to access, to have a little bit more clear, what does breathing do and what should I look out for? And if people do want to go to that next step, I do run a certification and training for health professionals, looking at the assessment and treatment of dysfunctional breathing and kind of the therapeutic application of that as well.
Great. And just say that link again, because we will link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect. So it's called the Breath Network. So the platform is school.com/the Breath Network, but I'll send that over to you, Joe.
Great. So we'll link to that. And of course, you can follow him at Breath Body Therapy. That's your Instagram handle. Is that right?
Correct. Same on Facebook, and my website's the same as well, breathbodytherapy.com.
Excellent. So I want to thank Campbell for being here this week talking about breathwork. If you are into breathwork or you don't know anything about breathwork, make sure to check out his work on his website, and then share this episode with your friends and family on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Instagram, or whenever anyone is talking about breathwork. I'm Dr. Joe Tatta. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. That's Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.